When strangers on airplanes ask me what I do for a living, I usually just say that I'm a teacher. Often enough, they leave it at that, which suits me fine, because if they ask what grade do you teach, and I end up having to admit that I teach ethics to ministers, my seatmate usually becomes uncomfortable. She or he will say something like, well, I guess I'd better watch what I say, as if I represented the thought police or the reincarnation of some long-ago Sunday school teacher come back to check up on their behavior. The discomfort arises, I suspect, because of the way we are used to thinking about ethics and about moral conduct in general. Mostly, we think of ethics as a set of rules that tell us that we shouldn't do what we want to do, sort of on analogy with a diet, which tells us to stay away from hot fudge and cheesecake and prime rib and pretty much everything else we really want to eat. The thing is, diets always make you feel bad. Either you follow them and feel deprived, or you go off them and feel guilty, or you eat just enough of the stuff you shouldn't that you don't feel satisfied, but you still get fat. I suspect, and therefore you feel both deprived and guilty at the same time. I suspect that most of us live our moral lives according to option 3. We don't follow enough of our questionable impulses to feel really satisfied, but we don't resist enough of them to feel righteous either. No wonder no one wants to sit next to an ethicist on an airplane. Things are even worse if you think about Christian ethics in particular, because most of us who have spent any time in the church and have listened to any of the fragments of the Bible that they read to us there, we know many things about how Christians are supposed to think and act. And on the face of it, several of those are impossible. On one hand, we are supposed to be perfect as God is perfect. Jesus says so right there in Matthew. This comes very near the place where Jesus tells us that desiring to do evil is essentially the same as actually doing it, so that lust is as bad as adultery and hatred is as wicked as murder. And he cheerfully advises that if your hand causes you to sin, you should cut it off and throw it away. I suppose that the remedy for evil thoughts is to cut off your head. See how the Bible is full of helpful moral advice. And all these texts are in the Sermon on the Mount, which oddly enough is one of the most popular parts of the New Testament. And while you're still trying to figure out those demands, the New Testament turns around and tells you that you have no hope of actually satisfying God, even by following these impossible directions. In fact, Paul, certainly the major thinker of the New Testament, declares as one of the central truths of Christian faith that we are all justly condemned according to God's righteousness. He recommends giving up the whole business of trying to please God and throwing yourself on the mercy of the court. For this piece of the story, you can look in Romans or Galatians, or for that matter, in the Gospel of John. But if, as Paul says, God's answer to sin has nothing to do with obedience to the law, then a lot of what we call ethics, at least our efforts to be good, seem beside the point. The answer seems to be that we confess the depth of our need and simply accept God's verdict of acquittal for the sake of his Son, who alone can fulfill the law and takes away its power to condemn us. Now let's suppose that you, having been in church all your life, take this combination of ridiculous demands and almost offensive leniency in your stride. Yep, that's how they talk in church, all right, heard it all before. Don't worry, the Bible will surprise you yet again. For if you keep reading it, it presents you with a glowing picture of the life of the church as a community of saints being fashioned into the very image of God, into the image of Christ's own holiness. This can make you look around your congregation, or for that matter, around your own life, and conclude that you have obviously wandered into the wrong movie. But there is nothing remarkable or even slightly original in anything that I've said. This is just the most basic Christian training that we all might have gotten in Sunday school. So what are we to think then? What do our Christian convictions have to do with how we act? Is there such a thing as living like a Christian? Well, I wish I could tell you that in 2,000 years of conversation we had come to some grand agreement. But in fact, across Christian history, there have been a wide range of answers to this question. You will recognize many of them. At one end of the spectrum is the position that says Christianity is all about faith, about believing in Jesus and putting your trust in his blood. As long as you do that, nothing else matters. In this way of thinking, all talk about behavior or virtue or moral obligations is labeled works righteousness. Christian life begins and ends with being saved by faith in Jesus as Savior. So the whole business of the church is just to get you to the foot of the cross and keep you there. At the other end of the spectrum, familiar in our mostly secular society, is the idea that Christianity is really just about being a good person. As long as you live a decent life and are kind to your neighbors, that's really all that God cares about. We hear this sort of thing all the time. Well, I'm not really a religious person, but I try to live a good life, and that's what's important, right? On this view, the reason Jesus came was to show us how to be better and more loving people. And our response is to try to live a reasonably moral life and to try hard. Garrison Keillor, I think, hits the right note when he talks about the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Responsibility. We all have a sense of what he's talking about there. But in between these two ends of the spectrum, there's a whole range of answers, ways of thinking about Christian faith and moral life, which lean one way or the other, and a few which try to hold these things together. On the one side, the Protestant rallying cry of justification by faith alone, and on the other, a serious call to a life of active discipleship. Now, since I have set this up so carefully, you will not be surprised to hear that I think that it's in this awkward and murky middle ground that the truth lies. Mostly I think this because it's the only way that we can read the whole Bible. The only way we can hear both Paul's declaration that we are saved by faith and not by works, and his consistent directions to the early Christians to walk worthy of the calling to which you are called. Both the invitation of Jesus the Savior, come to me who are heavy laden and I will give you rest, and the commands of Jesus the King, who asks, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and yet not do what I tell you? Only here can we hear John's assurance, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and still hear his insistence that the one who does not love his brother cannot love, and in fact does not know God, who is love. In short, this sort of balance is the place we are driven to when we try to hear and take seriously the whole of the biblical witness about Christian life.